Okay, everybody, welcome to this emergency situational briefing about the recent terror attacks in the States of Israel. I'm Benjamin Anthony, your host on behalf of the MirYam Institute, and I thank my colleagues at the MirYam Institute for bringing this together so swiftly as ever they do. We had a couple of small technical issues at the outset, so we may well be joined, we're hoping to be joined by Colonel David Hacham, retired officer in Israel Defense Forces, in just a few moments, but until then, the questions on this very heavy subject will be ably handled by our in-house analyst, Yaakov Lappin. But welcome to you one and all, and we appreciate you giving your time and your attention to a subject that suddenly, unfortunately, warrants that time and that attention. Yaakov, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Benjamin. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, and we appreciate it. And just to bring our audience up to speed, or really to provide some context for our conversation, Yaakov, an operation in Jenin was undertaken by the Israel Defense Forces last Thursday against a terror cell of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in order to prevent imminent attack plans against Israeli civilians. That group was found with charged explosives and loaded firearms, and the Israel Defense Forces killed 9 members of that cell, plus 1 civilian. That same evening, possibly in response to that operation, possibly not, rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip on Friday night, the Friday night just passed, on International Holocaust Memorial Day, in what was the worst terror attack in more than a decade. A Palestinian gunman from East Jerusalem killed 7 people and injured 3 more in the Neve Yaakov neighborhood. The names of those victims were Asher Natan, who was 14, Eli and Natalie Mizrahi, who were 48 and 45 respectively, Ilya Sosansky, 26, Raphael Ben Eliyahu, 56, Irina Korolova, 59, and Shaul Hai, who was 68 years old. Shot and wounded 2 Israeli men near the Old City. And on Saturday evening, a Palestinian gunman opened fire at a restaurant near Almog Junction, close to Jericho in Judea and Samaria, causing no injuries. And later that night, a Palestinian man armed with a handgun was shot dead by a security guard. Now, Yaakov, the head of the Police Operations Division in Israel, told reporters on Sunday that there were 41 intelligence alerts of potential terror attacks. And the Israeli National Police has now raised the national alert to its highest level following the deadly Jerusalem attack. So my first question to you, Yaakov, is just provide some layers of understanding to all of us. Talk us through the chain of events that I just read out, beginning perhaps by telling us about the terror cell that the IDF dismantled on Thursday.
I think layers is a really good choice of words here, Benjamin, because what we're seeing here really is the convergence of several layers of developments that have tragically produced this. We have to start with, in my opinion, is really Jenin in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. The northern West Bank city of Jenin is a city in which the Palestinian Authority has lost all control. Palestinian Authority forces cannot enter Jenin. They are afraid to enter Jenin. They are physically unable to do so. And into that power vacuum, gunmen and terrorists, both of the organized and the unorganized type, have moved in. And Palestinian Islamic Jihad is especially strong in Jenin. They have what the Shin Bet, the intelligence agency here, calls a developed infrastructure. And that means that they have the ability to get together, to plot attacks, to raise funds and receive funds for those attacks, to put together explosives, firearms, and to implement those attacks. And that's exactly the kind of cell that the Shin Bet picked up on. Now, what makes that operation on Thursday that you described so unusual is the fact that it happened to conduct these kinds of operations at night, where I'm sure that you're very familiar with the advantage of a nighttime security operation. There's less friction with the local population. You're seen less by the enemy, and generally it goes off smoother. But in this case, there was simply no time to spare because the danger was so imminent. And that is why a combined Israeli force of several elite units backed by border police entered Jenin and had to engage those gunmen fired on them from multiple directions, and they were able to return fire very accurately, neutralize the threats, and dismantle this terrorist cell, thereby saving very likely a very large number of Israeli defense establishment, doing what it does best, which is detecting organized Palestinian terrorism in time and moving, based on precise intelligence, moving very well-trained, capable forces into any place where they need to go in the West Bank in order to neutralize a threat. What happened the day after, on Friday night, is an example of a different kind of terrorism, which is far harder to stop, and that is the unorganized type. We have a resident of the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Al-Tur, and he acted on his own according to police initial assessments. He was likely enraged by the result of the Jenin operation, and he decided that he would, in his twisted and morally repugnant logic, even the score on behalf of the Palestinian people, not by taking on Israeli security forces, but by taking on indiscriminately Israeli civilians whose only crime was to be Israelis, to be Jews, and to be living in the capital city of Jerusalem. And we know the horrific results of that attack, and we're still reeling from the high number of casualties. And that kind of terrorism is far harder to stop because it doesn't leave behind an intelligence trail. And there are tools, perhaps we can talk about this if we have time, on the ways in which the Israeli intelligence community can and does stop lone wolf terrorism, but it's much harder to do. And that's the kind of terrorism that police often find themselves facing. That's why they're now on the highest level of alert, because they're the last line of defense, really. When there's no intelligence alert, it's up to the forces on the ground to respond very quickly to that kind of attack. And those are the kinds of developments that we've been seeing over the past few days here.
So, Yaakov, thanks for giving us those extra details. You mentioned this word disorganized in describing what some people call lone wolf attacks. And I want to pick up on that because this 13-year-old Palestinian boy, the one who shot 2 Israeli men near the old city, in my opinion, it tells a very clear story. And I watched the video of that shooting, and I can tell you very, very clearly that boy exhibited a degree of confidence and familiarity with the weapon and a degree of precision that can only have come about, in my judgment, through sustained weapons training and, most alarmingly, clarity of mission, however depraved that mission may have been, and comfort with the mission. Now, explain to us the scale and whereabouts of such training, because as we both know, we were once 13 years of age. Neither the average 13-year-old boy nor the average 30-year-old man exhibits that degree of fluency with a weapon without having been very, very well trained in a sustained manner. Now, that's very different, Yaakov, to the stabbing attacks that we witnessed in 2015, where Palestinians, including teens, were wielding kitchen knives at their victims. That's the lack of organization you were referring to. This is a 13-year-old boy, in this case, trained and deploying his weapon. Where is that training taking place?
Benjamin, I don't know whether that boy was really, really trained, or whether he took a gun from his relatives and went into a field and took some practice shots and day after day, gained confidence in his use of the firearm. You are better equipped than I am to gauge his level of training. But what I can tell you is that there are 2 things that came together to enable this shocking disarmament shooting 2 Israelis in the streets of East Jerusalem. There are 2 things that came together to enable that. One is the availability of firearms in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank and in the Arab-Israeli community within the state of Israel. This is a huge problem. The streets are awash with guns. Some of them are smuggled in from places like Jordan, places, across the Middle East, over the border and into the West Bank and the state of Israel. Some are stolen from military bases. Some are manufactured in workshops, in Palestinian workshops. The bottom line is that the streets are flooded with guns. And that means that anybody who's really determined to get hold of a firearm can do that. And it's far easier for terrorists to do that today than it was in 2015, which is why we're seeing this, and I hate to use the word upgrade, from stabbing attacks to shooting attacks. This is why we're seeing so many more shooting attacks today than we did in 2015. Now, the other component of this attack is hatred and incitement. What did that boy see on his phone in the social media networks that put into his head the idea that this was the right thing to do for his people, for some sort of religious motto? The fact is that he must have been exposed to unending incitement, which encourages all people who are exposed to that content to pick up a weapon and murder Jews on the streets of Israel. And I think that we have to analyze where some of that incitement is coming from. Some of it is coming from Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Very, very deliberate. And in that sense, I think it's correct to say this is not completely unorganized. There is an engine that's promoting these actions. And part of that engine is in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is playing a double game. On the one hand, it's preserving quiet in Gaza itself. But on the other hand, it's trying to export its violent jihadist and murderous ideology to the West Bank, to East Jerusalem, and into Israel proper, where it's very convenient for it to see the flames erupt, Israelis get murdered, and the Palestinian Authority look weak and grow increasingly weaker. And it can do all of this without risking its home base in Gaza. That is the strategy that Hamas is currently employing. And their incitement is a major part of what we're seeing. So that is the linkage I would make between the organized and the unorganized spheres of terrorism that we're seeing.
I'll just add again, or I'll reiterate my view. I think that boy was trained. I don't believe that a young boy can simply grasp a firearm like that, learn how to load it, learn how to hide behind a vehicle, which is what he did. By the way, for our listeners and viewers, this is all out there in the open. You can go and you can search a videoed recording of this particular attack. That is a trained individual, shockingly young for his training, but virtue of his mission, however misguided and wrong that mission may be and profane it may be. Let's pull a little bit further back, because this comes to what you were speaking about with regard to Judea and Samaria, and of course Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And that's the strategic significance of all of this. So Meir Ben Shabbat, who was the former national security advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he has expressed that the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, has absolutely failed in its mandate to combat terrorism emanating from Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. He's actually raised the question, as a consequence of that failure, of why the Palestinian Authority needs to exist at all, given that it is falling short of upholding one of its central responsibilities, namely countering terrorist activities aimed against Israeli civilians. He's also warned that as a result of the failure of the Palestinian Authority, we could see a return to the wide-ranging operations such as Operation Defensive Shield, which the IDF launched back in 2002 to curb the horrific violence and homicide bombings that were emanating from Judea and Samaria at that time. Do you think that that's possible, Yaakov, or do you think Ben Shabbat's speaking somewhat hyperbolically when he suggests that we'll see a return to a large-scale military operation in Judea and Samaria?
So there's a lot up in the air there. Let's try and take it down one by one. Regarding the possibility of a larger military operation, that is certainly an option. It's on the table. It's on the cabinet's table. However, and this is a big however, I don't think we can compare the current situation to what we had prior to Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. Agreed. And the reason for that is because the IDF, since Defensive Shield, has never really left the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. It is conducting nightly security operations, just like the type that we saw in Jenin. The only difference with the Jenin operation was that it was daytime and that it had a high number of casualties. But the actual operation is something that's going on an almost weekly basis in that city. And Nablus and all of the areas that the Palestinian Authority is failing to control are seeing the IDF come in on a nightly basis and conduct those arrests and, if necessary, those firefights. And that means that Israel has a degree of operational control and intelligence control over those areas that it never had prior to 2002. So I think we need to put that context on the table. Regarding the role of the Palestinian Authority, I think, in the Middle East and in the sort of school of realism that I very much believe in when it comes to understanding Israeli interests in this region. I think we have to always look at alternatives. And there is so much we can say against the Palestinian Authority, and all of the criticism would be absolutely valid. But what I want to add to that discussion is that without the Palestinian Authority being in its place, I think Israel's strategic situation would be worse. And the reason for that is, A, the Palestinian Authority still manages a large percentage of Area A, where over 2 million Palestinians live. Israel does not want to directly manage and govern those areas. Israeli soldiers do not want to be 24 hours a day in the Kasbah of Nablus. Israel doesn't want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in sewage treatment and garbage collection in the middle of Palestinian cities. It's not a situation that would serve Israel economically, security-wise, and politically in any way. And it would represent many dangers, I think, for Israel. And for that reason, the Palestinian Authority's existence is something that serves Israel's interest in its ability to take a step back from the massive resource drainage that would come from direct control of 2 million plus Palestinians in the West Bank. And just for that reason alone, even if we don't talk about other things, just for that reason alone, I think the Palestinian Authority's existence serves Israel's core interests. In addition to that, if we're talking about alternatives, I think there are only two real alternatives in the West Bank today. And one is Fatah / the Palestinian Authority. The second is Hamas. I don't see any powerful Palestinian movement that could be added to that menu, to that very small menu. And therefore, if I have to, as an Israeli, choose who I'm looking to deal with on the other side of the green line, I'm going to choose Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, despite all of their many, many shortfalls and all of the criticisms absolutely valid. I'm going to choose them over the mortal enemy that is Hamas. So that, in a nutshell, is how I view that issue strategically.
I want to talk a little bit more about the situation there in Judea and Samaria and the viability of another wide-ranging military operation there. So the MirYam Institute just hosted retired General Chico Tamir, and we hosted him in the United States for a lecture series. And he is, among other things, the former commander of the Golani Brigade, a vaunted brigade of the Israel Defense Forces, and of the Gaza Division. And he's generally credited, Yaakov, with turning Israel's fortunes back to our favor in Judea and Samaria, because he was the officer who most forcefully advocated taking the fight to the terrorists in Judea and Samaria, breaking and smashing their strongholds and removing their operatives and capabilities from the field. What's very, very clear from Chico, though, is that there wasn't a great deal of political will for such an operation prior to its launch, and that initially the confidence to undertake such an operation was lacking even among the top branch of the Israel Defense Forces, including the then Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Shaul Mofaz. Now, you've said that such an operation, plans for such an operation, are on the table with the Security Cabinet right now. Do you think that the confidence that was absent prior to the operation in 2002 is now present today? Or do you think that Israel wants to keep its distance from becoming entangled in Judea and Samaria?
I'm going to say that both are true, and I'll explain. The fact that Israel is sending forces into a place like Jenin in broad daylight demonstrates a high degree of confidence. Even if it's a pinpoint operation, the fact that it can become entangled, the fact that firefights are likely and those forces are going in all of the time, is a demonstration of real confidence in the capabilities of Israel's security forces to go into those areas and not to let them deteriorate into the kinds of places that they were leading up to the 2002 Operation Defensive Shield. And at the same time, Israel is definitely interested in avoiding a larger scale escalation in Judea and Samaria because there are simply strategic priorities that are more important and more urgent for Israel to deal with. And one of those is the fact that Israeli ground forces are very much in need to be trained and to be continually trained without disruption for a far greater enemy. And that enemy is Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon, as we all know, is an extension and a proxy of Iran. Iran's nuclear program is making disturbing progress all of the time. Israel and Iran may find themselves on a collision course in the next couple of years. We've just seen reports about various mysterious attacks, both on the Syrian and Iraqi border and in Iran. So the entire Iranian axis forms a severe strategic security threat for Israel. And Israel, because it is a country even that has a very impressive and capable military, it still wishes to prioritize and not get pulled into multiple arenas all at the same time. So if it can prioritize readiness for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for the Iranian threat, for the northern theater, and avoid an escalation, if it can, and there's no guarantee that it can, avoid an escalation and a drainage on ground forces in the West Bank and possibly in Gaza too, because, one arena can easily ignite the other, then it will try and avoid that. If it can't avoid it, then it's going to deal with the security threats that appear in the Palestinian arena. But if it can avoid it, it will seek to avoid it, specifically because Israel has bigger fish to fry, and that is Iran and Hezbollah. Those demand a lot of readiness, a lot of training, a lot of capability building. And I'll just finish this point by saying that, we've been in this dilemma before. In the lead up to this 2006 Second Lebanon War, the IDF was extremely busy with counterterrorism and policing operations in Judea and Samaria, to the point where that negatively affected its ability to identify Hezbollah's transformation from a terrorist organization into a hierarchical army. And the realization that was neglected was partly due to the fact that the IDF was so busy in the West Bank. And that's one of the lessons that was learned from that time. And that's one of the reasons why there is an attempt now to avoid that kind of trap today going forward.
Thank you very much, Yaakov. So we're going to carry on with this on the issue. You've really pulled back the lens there, and I always appreciate that. I want to talk now about the impact of this when it comes to some additional strategic considerations we have. So recent events, the ones about which we're talking right now, they've obviously impacted upon all of us, and they've cast something of a pall over the visit of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's right now in Israel for a 2-day visit. And despite the impact of these events, Meir Ben Shabbat, the former national security advisor to Netanyahu that I quoted earlier, he's argued very, very strongly that issues with the Palestinians must be firmly presented as a secondary issue from the Israeli perspective, the primary issue being Iran. Can you share your thoughts on that? Do you think that we can successfully keep the focus on Iran, or do you think perhaps that the Palestinian issue is actually an issue of the level of first order issues that Israel must tackle?
Israel will have to tackle the Palestinian issue one way or the other. The question is how it will tackle it. Will it be primarily through a military emphasis, or will Israel's ability to deal with the Palestinian issue be tied to a much longer term strategy? And I think that, if we're talking about prioritization of arenas and adversaries, I think Meir Ben Shabbat's observation that Iran is the number one focus right now for Israel is absolutely correct. Iran is developing a nuclear program. That's an unprecedented threat that this state is facing. And when you combine that with Iran's regional activities, its entrenchment, its buildup in Lebanon, its attempt to infiltrate Syria, those issues are a far greater military threat to Israel than Palestinian terrorism, as awful as it is. So if there is a way to turn the flames down as much as possible and contain, and through the selective use of force, but to contain and control the Palestinian arena, in order to prioritize attention and readiness for Iran and the Iranian axis in this region, I think most members of the Israeli defense establishment would prefer to do that. If that's not possible, then of course, it's simply not possible. And then they will, the Israeli military will have to answer all requirements that appear out of Judea and Samaria and possibly the Gaza Strip. But it will prefer to prioritize. It comes back to that question of prioritization. And that's why I think that, when we talk about the Palestinians and the use of force, I think there has to be a clear long-term strategy about, what Israel wants to do with these areas, how it wants to proceed in the long term, and how it wants to manage the various arenas that are knocking on its door, at the beginning of 2023, in order to optimize its use of resources, in the most strategically sound manner, rather than just going to every arena at the same time, full power ahead.
So on that note, let's turn back a little bit more to the Palestinian Arabs, and I want to talk about our new Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. Yoav Gallant was originally some years back he was in premier position to become the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces. He then went into politics and began in the Kulanu party, which is now a defunct party, then joined the Likud party. He held several portfolios therein, and now he has risen to the position of defense minister, as many people expected. And his first briefing to the press as defense minister, I believe, was one in which he spoke to the media from the IDF headquarters in Judea and Samaria. And he outlined, Yaakov, something of a stick-carrot approach in that order, saying that Israel will, quote, enact offensive and proactive actions against those who try to harm our children. Anyone who helps the terrorists will be harmed. If needed, we will demolish their homes. We will deprive them of their rights. If needed, we will expel them. Now, all of that is attributed, all of those comments are attributed to being aimed at those who assist terrorists rather than the terrorists themselves. So it seems that the Minister of Defense has raised the possibility of expelling the families of those who commit acts of terror against Israelis elsewhere, possibly to the Gaza Strip or to more remote areas of Judea and Samaria. Do you think such an approach is likely to be implemented, and will those statements have a deterrent effect?
I think that, the question that you're asking is really part of a bigger question, which is, what is the balancing line that Israel should walk down when it comes to responding to Palestinian terrorism? Because on the one hand, it will always need to be able to deploy an iron fist to deal with terrorism, to engage, disrupt, and respond and kill those who come to kill its citizens. And that is never going to be in question. That is always a consensus within Israeli society. Once we move beyond that, and we start talking about the outer circle, the envelopes of terrorism, you could get people who would say, well, why stop at the family? Well, what about the street? What about the neighborhood? What about people who support this? And the reason that I think many in the Israeli defense establishment are cautious about extending the iron fist too far, so to speak, is because they have concluded that it's counterproductive. In other words, today, we have 130,000 Palestinians in the West Bank who work either in Israel or in Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. And if we think of, about the fact that every one of those supports a family of, 5, 6, maybe 7 people, we start to understand that the Israeli economy is responsible for probably at least a quarter of the Palestinian GDP, if not more. And those people are not joining the cycle of terrorism. They may be sympathetic, they may not be. I'm not going to guess right now. There's a separate problem of how generally accepted and celebrated terrorism is in Palestinian society, and it's hugely disturbing, and that needs to be tackled. But in terms of action, those people are not lifting up their hands, they're not taking guns, they're not shooting anybody, they're coming up, showing up for work, and they're going home. And that is an example of the carrot that you mentioned. Now, that means that it's an Israeli interest to enable those people to continue to come to work. Because if, punishment is meted out to, let's say, an entire neighborhood or village from which terrorists came from, and they don't go to work, the chances of terrorists recruiting these people who are now unemployed simply goes up. They have less to lose. And that goes back to the same question as the family and the expulsion. So, Israel has expelled various terrorists, and David Hacham can probably talk a lot about this, a lot more than I can. They were expelled to Lebanon, in the 80s. It didn't really solve that much because they formed terrorist groups in Lebanon, and when they came to Gaza, they also continued those terrorist activities in Gaza. So, unless we can expel them, out of the region completely, and that also throws up, legal problems as well. It's not clear whether the cost benefit of that move is going to be worthwhile for Israeli security interests. And I'm open to hearing the debate, and the legal issue is a separate issue. I don't think the Israeli High Court would green light the expulsion of a family. As far as I understand, that would probably contravene Israeli law. But legal questions aside, the cost benefit of such a move is not clear cut. I think when we think from the brain and less from the gut, it's always a question of cost benefit. And I think everything in security comes down to cost benefit, and it's a complex and difficult debate to have.
So, Yaakov, let us know. We've been joined here by Colonel David Hacham, retired officer of the Israel Defense Force. Let's talk about Yoav Gallant. David, just a direct question. He seems to have suggested that those who assist terrorists who harm Israeli citizens or worse, that those people will be expelled. Now, Yaakov spoke about the idea of that being counterproductive. Can you tell us a little bit about the practice of expelling individuals from Israel, where they go to, and do you view it as helpful, or do you view it as a hindrance, David?
No. Listen, when I'm looking to my experience as regards to all the means taken by the Israeli authorities, by the IDF, by the Shabak, the General Intelligence Service, and when I'm looking to our, lessons from all these means that we're taking against the Palestinian terrorists, I must tell you that in the list of the means that Israel used during the years, number one in terms of effectiveness vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis the Palestinian terrorists, vis-a-vis the Palestinian organization, was the expel of the leaders from the territories, from Gaza and from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria alike. I'm talking to you about maybe the first intifada, and even before the first intifada. There were many deportation of Palestinian leaders. In this respect, I must mention maybe one which is very much known. I don't know if the name of the leader of Al-Jihad al-Islam al-Falastini in the Gaza Strip is known to you, Fathi Shqaqi, Dr. Fathi Shqaqi. He was, arrested by Israel before the eruption of the first intifada. In the year 1988, in the March or April 1988, he was expelled to Lebanon. And later on, he arrived to Damascus, and he led the Al-Jihad al-Islami from Damascus. But at the end of the day, while he was in a visit in Libya, when he wanted to come back to Syria, he flew through Malta. And Mossad agents came to Malta. It was in the 26th of October 1995. That is to say, several weeks before the signing of the interim agreement by Yitzhak Rabin, the late Yitzhak Rabin. I'm talking to you like 30 years ago. This was like a nightmare for the Palestinian organization. The deportation of people from the territories. This was like a very, very effective move, I would say, mean taken by Israel in this regard. I think that still until today, the deportation of activists, of Palestinian activists, terrorists from the territories is something that Israel has to do. But at the same breath, I must tell you that when I'm looking to the opportunities of Israel of how to react vis-a-vis the Palestinian terrorists, I think today that number one in effectiveness is what I call the targeted killings. This is something that they are very much, disturbed that Israel will take this mean vis-a-vis the Palestinian terrorists. And I've heard time and again, during the last operation in Gaza, Al-Jihad al-Islami people are speaking that Israel shouldn't, take this mean in order to deport, Palestinian terrorists from the territories, from both the Gaza Strip and Gaza. But I must tell you something very much important now. we are several days after the terrorist operation in Jerusalem, the two terrorist operations. The first one, in Shabbat night, Erev Shabbat, the evening of Shabbat, and six Jews were killed. I think that this is something that Israel cannot, I would say, not react vis-a-vis what happened. But at the same time, I think that
Sorry, David, what do you mean Israel can't react? If 7 Israeli citizens are killed by terror, there has to be a reaction, there has to be a response. Can you just clarify what you mean there?
Yes, I want to clarify. You are right.
Thank you.
I think, first of all, in principle, Israel must react, must retaliate.
Okay, right.
But at the same time, I want to tell you, Benjamin, something very much important. I don't think that Israel should escalate the situation from itself.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand this. I mean, at the end of the day, I told this Yaakov a couple of days ago, I think that Israel won't have any other choice during this year, 2023, but to wage a large scale of military, operation in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. But this is, of course, in condition that the terrorist act will continue in Judea and Samaria. And I can tell you in this regard, only from today, from my conversations with Palestinians from Ramallah, that the situation today is very much tense. And the prospects, the chances that this wave of terrorism will be ended is something in the air. It's not on the ground. And everybody has to be prepared for the continuity of terror activities in the territories. In any case, I think some retaliation move has to be taken by Israel.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot tolerate Jews being killed in your capital in the evening of Shabbat without having any, any move, any reaction taken by the Israeli military. This is something out of question. At the same time, what I'm saying is very much, I would like to be very accurate in what I'm saying. I think that Israel shouldn't act in a way, or I put it in a different way, in large-scale operation that will turn the situation, from left to right,
Mm-hmm.
In order not to bring escalation to the area.
I understand, David. I understand.
I hope
and
that
thank you for...
the idea was...
No, it was. Thank you for clarifying. I think, tell me if I'm misrepresenting you. I think what you're saying is that Israel should respond, but Israel should respond at the time and in the manner of its own choosing, not in a wild reaction to this terrible series of terrorist attacks. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly, but not large-scale operation.
Mm-hmm. Pinpoint operations. Okay.
Yeah.
So David, I want to ask you something else, David, now, because we've seen another change afoot, and I'm going to ask Yaakov to weigh in on this first, and then David, I'll come back to you about it. Look, Yaakov, when you have this level of terror attacks against Israel's civilians, the Israel Defense Forces has to adjust. And 3 additional battalions have been deployed to Judea and Samaria since Friday. And the IDF also plans to deploy another 2 infantry companies from the Golani Brigade and the Givati Brigade to assist the Israeli National Police in the Jerusalem area and in the Israeli towns near the security barrier. Now, I want to go back, David, please, I hope that you followed this part of our conversation before you dialed in, but I'm going back now to some comments made by Meir Ben Shabbat, the former national security advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that the Palestinian issue is a secondary issue. And while that may be the case in terms of Israeli national security priorities, Yaakov, here you have a perfect example of how a secondary issue has primary implications for Israel, because battalions and companies from the Israel Defense Forces that are sent to the Jerusalem area to reinforce the work of the Israeli National Police, in my opinion, are not doing what they are supposed to do, namely preparing and training for war fighting. And that can impact us. It can impact us in Gaza, it can impact us in Lebanon, and it can impact us elsewhere. So I'd like to ask you, how would you assess the IDF's level of combat readiness, given the fact that we are constantly diverting resources and time, quite frankly, to countering terror rather than readying ourselves for war fighting?
This is it. This is exactly the dilemma and the trap that, we have to be so aware of. And I couldn't agree with you more that, any kind of policing mission by soldiers who are helping police, in places like Jerusalem would absolutely be taking them off war training and readiness. In terms of how prepared the IDF ground forces are, I'm actually more of an optimist. I believe that today, the Israeli ground forces level of training, quality of training, command and control capabilities, technology that is beginning to really arrive and enable IDF ground units to act as a single network, a combat network that is in real-time touch with the Air Force, with the Navy, that can activate air power. You have a situation today where you have battalion commanders that are able to activate fighter jets from a tablet and get them to strike targets, within seconds. And this kind of stuff was just unthinkable even 10 years ago. I believe that the IDF ground forces today are better prepared for war against Hezbollah than they've probably been at any time in IDF history since Hezbollah has been a threat to the state of Israel. I believe that the ball has dropped, so to speak, and the understanding that Hezbollah is not some, guerrilla terror force, but is a hierarchical army that is armed with more firepower, at least in terms of its surface-to-surface firepower, than most NATO armies. And the fact that it can rain down, a very significant level of destruction down on Israeli cities, and that the only way to extinguish that threat, fully extinguish it, is through a very rapid ground offensive. I think that ball has dropped, that realization has sunk in, and the ground forces are training for that. Now, the IDF has to be able to deal with more than one front simultaneously. But what it has done, I think, in terms of at least Judea and Samaria is concerned, is it's constantly finding solutions that give ground forces more and more time to train. And that includes the setting up of more and more territorial defense battalions whose job is only to secure their areas. We're seeing these pop up along the Jordanian border, along the Egyptian border. That frees up, IDF wartime battalions to train for war. It really helps free them up. And there are other, things going on that are basically designed to put combat training front and center. So I think the IDF has learned lessons. It has improved its readiness. Has really improved. Also, we can talk about changes in the IDF armored core. I think the level of protection enjoyed by armored vehicles today in Israel is world leading. I don't think there are tanks like the Merkava tank today around the world that have the trophy active protection system that can not only intercept the kinds of anti-tank missiles that caused so much damage in 2006, but can use their radars to pinpoint the enemy, spread that information on the combat network, and create what they call a rapid sensor to shooter cycle, and to track the enemy down and find his exact location and direct firepower to that. So I don't want to be too comfortable with the IDF's readiness. There's always things to improve, and there are always risks and failures. But I do believe that the readiness is high, and I do believe that it's improving. And I believe that if, say, 3-4 years ago, the quality gap between Israel and its enemies was beginning to decrease to a disturbing level because Israel's enemies figured out how to use urban areas as rocket launch zones, how to hide, how to stay out of the IDF's radar, and quite literally, actually. Today, I think that quality is coming back. The gap is starting to increase again in Israel's favor. And I think Israel has really started to internalize how to wage this kind of asymmetric war. So on that front, I'm more optimistic than I am pessimistic.
So David Hacham, we've got this interesting situation in the new government whereby you have a defense minister, right? And that's Yoav Gallant. And then you also have a national security minister, and that is Itamar Ben-Gvir. And there's also Bezalel Smotrich, and there's tension between these three, it seems. Now, I spoke about Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, saying that he seemed to be saying that he would consider expelling those who assist terrorists to be on the borders of Israel. You say that that's a very effective measure. Itamar Ben-Gvir has said that he would swiftly apply the death penalty to those who bring about atrocities against Israel's citizens and civilians. What do you think about that sort of statement? Is that, again, for political consumption, or do you think that that's a prospect that might have some teeth to it?
Listen, first of all, as regard to the death penalties, I think, as I've said a couple of days ago, this is something that Israel shouldn't apply.
Should not.
Exercise. Sorry?
Should or should not?
Should not exercise, should not do it.
Mm-hmm.
This is something out of question. Listen, I don't want to see, places in the jails in which, I don't want to say hundreds, but many Palestinian terrorists are being hanged. This is something which is not going hand by hand with the Jewish values. And more than that, not only the moral issue in this regard, I'm speaking about the result. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking about what result or what effectiveness or what influence it will have on future, Palestinian terrorists. When the Palestinian terrorist is coming to carry out a terror act against Israeli civilians or military alike, he thinks that at the end of the day, maybe he won't get out alive. So it means that he is ready to sacrifice himself, to die in this operation. So the issue of death is not something which he is taking it into the calculation before he is going to carry out this terror act. This is why I think that this is out of question. Israel shouldn't exercise death penalties against Palestinian terrorists. And I think at the end of the day, the grade of deterrence is not something high that you can take the risk and execute these death penalties against the Palestinian terrorists.
David, let me present you with a quick counterpoint to that, just to bear this out for our viewers and our listeners. So you mentioned that the expulsion of individuals is a very powerful deterrent to the Palestinian Arabs and the terrorists among them. Okay. You also mentioned that targeting killings were a very powerful, potent deterrent, and also a powerful act in their own right, regardless of deterrence. They disrupt the activities of terrorist organizations. Let's look on the other side. The fact of the matter is that the terrorist organizations, including Hamas, their number one deterrent towards Israel is the prospect of the kidnapping of an Israeli soldier and the detaining and the holding of an Israeli soldier, even an Israeli citizen. As we've seen, they recently released a video of Mengistu over there in the Gaza Strip, who's been held for a number of years. Benjamin Netanyahu just met with his mother, I believe today or yesterday that was. Look, part of the impetus for this kidnapping policy is the fact that they now know, unfortunately, that across a long enough time span, terrorists with blood on their hands may well be released as part of an exchange. Israel's captives, one or two, in return for terrorists with blood on their hands. Now, just bearing out Ben-Gvir's suggestion here, and I'm not voicing an opinion of my own, but would not the notion of terrorists with blood on their hands facing the death penalty, would that not reduce the number of terrorists that are there for release in the event of an exchange, and therefore curb the enthusiasm for the kidnapping of Israeli soldiers?
As I told you before, there are two, I would say, aspects for this question and for the answer. First of all, I'm speaking about the effectiveness of this kind of a move. Mm-hmm. As I've told you before, when a Palestinian terrorist is come to carry out a terror act against Israelis, he is taking into consideration that at the end of the day, he won't get out of this operation alive. So he is willing to sacrifice himself no matter what. This is one thing. And the second thing is the moral issue. Listen, we are a democratic state, a Jewish state. We have our values. I don't want to see Israel with, many incidents of getting death sentences against Palestinian terrorists. This is something out of question. I tell you more than that, something very much important. You mentioned before, you said that you think that maybe the Palestinian organization, Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, would carry out, kidnapping of Israeli soldiers or civilians in order to bargain vis-a-vis Israel for the release of their people inside the Israeli jails. Listen, we have the experience of the last 30, 40 years. We have the experience of release of thousands of Palestinian, terrorists from the Israeli jail. I remember May 1985, more than 1,000 for 3 Israeli soldiers. Later on, what's his name? The soldier that was kidnapped, Gilad Shalit, etc., etc. Listen, I want to think that now, I'm not in the military or security establishment now, I'm not in service now, but I want to think that today, Israel won't repeat this mistake in the future of, thousands of Palestinian terrorists being released from jail for one soldier, 3 soldiers, 2 civilians. This is out of question,
There's another angle here as well, I think, and I'm sorry for barging in, but David, you told me, I think it was yesterday, that if Palestinian terrorist organizations see one of their own coming up for a death sentence, for capital punishment, the likely result of that would be them being more motivated to kidnap Israeli civilians and soldiers in order to try and prevent that execution. Is that correct?
Correct, 100%. This will encourage the Palestinian organization to carry out kidnap operation against Israeli civilians and military ally in order to get release of their people inside, the Israeli jail. But I'm saying I'm totally against death penalties of Palestinian terrorists.
Thank you, David. So I only have time for one. I only have time for one last question. But before I move on to it, 2 quick comments. First of all, I think it's absolutely remarkable, David, and it speaks volumes about the principles with which our senior defense establishment figures operate. When we hear someone with your pedigree, with the amount of time that you've spent operating in the Gaza Strip, in on the negotiations with leaders of Hamas, all sorts of other things that you undertook in service to our country, and yet you still say our standards must be aligned with our own measurements of our standards. They must not be informed by the depravity of the enemy. And I think that that's a great, great testament, which you may not necessarily think of directly because it's just part of who you are. But I hope that our listeners and our viewers do appreciate that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm just going to say this, time will tell, and I wish it wasn't the case. I think you're wrong. I think that unfortunately your ambition for the policy of prisoners or terrorists to be released in exchange for soldiers, I don't think that it's out of the question when it comes to the decision-making in the Security Cabinet. I wish it was. But I hope you're correct, but I dare say I fear that you are mistaken. I don't think it's been removed at all. I have no reason to think that. So let's just move on to the final question here for both of you, and I'm going to ask for a short answer just in deference to our listeners and our viewers. David, you are somebody, you came on here when you joined this particular episode and you spoke about the first intifada, you lived through the second intifada. I mentioned that you were involved in the dispatching of key individuals at the top of Hamas. When I say dispatched, I mean we were involved in the elimination of those individuals, some of them. A lot of people talk about an intifada. Sometimes I think they use that term too loosely, but let me ask you a brief, quick answer. Are we in the midst of another intifada?
It's really the main question nowadays. I'll tell you frankly, I think that today the chances for another intifada to be carried out by the Palestinians are higher than before. And I'll tell you one thing, first of all, in a very short way. The frustration in the Palestinian side is very high, in a high degree, of no progress, no promotion in the peace process, in negotiations with the state of Israel, and they are very much frustrated. This is something that we have to take into consideration. And secondly, you have to bear in mind that we are speaking about the last phase of Abu Mazen in the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. He's like 87 years old, and he's going, this is the last, period of time of Abu Mazen in the Palestinian leadership. And the situation nowadays in the Palestinian arena is that Abu Mazen is very weak, and we are now at the midst of the internal struggle among the potential candidates to come to power after Abu Mazen. So the situation is very much, complicated in the Palestinian side. And I think in answering, in one word or two words to your question about the intifada, the chances are very high now that a new round of hostilities, and I think the word intifada maybe is not the proper way to use, because as you probably know, the intifada means more, civilian acts, demonstrations, etc., etc. But in this case, I think that we are going to see more terrorist operations, terrorist acts against Israeli civilians and Israeli soldiers.
Yaakov, a derivative of the same question. You're in near constant touch with active senior members of the Israeli security establishment. Are you hearing them bandy about the word intifada? Do they seem to think we're in the midst of one now?
It depends on how you define intifada. But I think that, we were talking at the beginning of this conversation on different kinds of terrorism. So the scenario of an escalation in the number of lone wolf or technically unorganized terrorism seems to be more likely than not in the coming months. We've got Ramadan coming up in the second half of March, which has proven in recent years to be a time when inflammatory and hardline Islamist messages particularly seem to get through. And the incitement, reaches peak level. We've got tensions around the Temple Mount. We've got flashpoints, in every counter-terrorist operation going forward, and Jenin could turn into a new flashpoint. So yes, there are many factors that can push the situation into an intifada mode, but there are also restrainers. When we're looking at what influences reality, there is the economic equation, the carrot that we discussed. Under the current Israeli government and its relationship with the Palestinian Authority, there will clearly be no diplomatic process to speak of from either direction, from either the PA, which is basically dysfunctional, or from the Israeli government, which does not believe that such a process will lead anywhere. So that will not be put into the mix. And just from a security perspective, a process like that could have a calming effect to a certain degree, but it won't be there. So we have all of these ingredients into the mix, and the situation is unpredictable. A certain escalation seems likely, but how far that escalation can go is completely up for grabs. And I'll just finish by saying one more thing. The scenario of lone wolf, terrorists, people picking up guns and committing atrocities is only one version of how an intifada could look like. Another version could be, say, sections of the PA security forces turning their guns, God forbid, on Israelis. A total falling apart of the PA. I'm going to extreme scenarios, a Hamas takeover of certain Palestinian cities. I'm going to these extreme scenarios because I want to put the wider possibilities into view. And that would be a real, escalation, of full-blown escalation. And that's the kind of situation that Israel is going to seek to avoid.
Well, Yaakov, I don't think that those are extreme scenarios. I think they're scenarios about which all of us have to be very, very clear-eyed. We've seen such scenarios play out throughout the Middle East, where various forces, Western forces, have been operating and they've been fired upon by those to whom they supply the weaponry in the first place. And I have to say, we don't have time to go into it now, but it, of course, raises the question about the wisdom of having armed the PA in the first place. And that's something that we can discuss at another time. But I appreciate you drawing that to the attention of all of us. And so to you, Yaakov, in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute, and to retired Colonel David Hacham, we thank you very much for your time. We're sorry that we've had to convene this during a wave of terrible terror attacks against our citizens in Israel, the worst of which took place during Holocaust, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, that deterred the terrorists not one jot, of course. And I thank our listeners and our viewers for being here and for, as I said at the top, really directing their time and attention to a subject that warrants that time. And for all of the House of Israel, we pray for Shalom al Israel, peace over Israel. Thank you very, very much indeed to both of you. And thank you for raising our level of understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.